Right. Good morning. Thanks for everyone for coming. I'm Kate Jenkins from the Energy Saving Trust, and we'll be moderating this session. So we've got three really interesting presenters today with the focus on renewable energy, but coming at it from a number of different ways. So first of all, I'd like to hand over to Tom and Theo from the Evaluation Department of the EBRD. So Tom and Theo, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to our session. We are, with my colleague Theo Sanz, very happy to be here, especially as this conference is slightly different for us than what we usually are used to. We usually find ourselves at the conferences with other departments of international financial institutions, and this one is really impressive with a lot of scientists and doing very rigorous evaluation. We realize is slightly different. So I think I might just start with saying a few words about EBRD, who we are, because many of you might not be familiar with what we do. So EBRD is one of the regional banks created back in '91. So we are a relatively young organization. We've been providing financing mainly to countries of Central and Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Africa, Turkey recently, and we are moving to Africa as well. We are owned by 71 governments, European Union and EIB, and by now we funded about 170 billion in projects, mainly with private sector. We are different from the World Bank and other IFIs that we work in principle with private sector. This is true for solar projects, for energy projects. Energy is very close to our heart. We want to be climate bank. So in most of our projects, from cookie factories to pipelines, we really emphasize energy efficiency and sustainability. The purpose of our funding is not only to provide financing, but to ensure a so-called transition impact, which is transition from centrally planned to market economy. We have so-called transition qualities, inclusion, green, competitiveness, and few others. So our evaluations are focused on verifying what our bankers were saying in board reports when they requested funding from the board, and what panned out, in fact, and whether this transition impact has been achieved. So a little bit different what we heard here before, what this audience has been doing. So it's mainly accountability and learning, the purpose of our evaluations. So as far as projects we are to present, we've done evaluation of a cluster of projects. Solar projects, our bank financed about 69 projects by 2020. This is how we are to present it. We have first slide, which is a spoiler, because it encapsulates everything it was important, what we are to convey here. We are encouraged to have it for impatient executives who don't have time to listen to the whole presentation and just would like to know immediately what we want to say. So we will explain details later, but just to highlight the main, the key messages here. So when we looked at 10 projects in 6 countries, we looked at investments, but also at policy dialogue and so-called technical cooperation projects, which were related to these projects. And the main conclusion was that this policy was absolutely critical. Without it, the bank would not be able to finance any solar projects. Our consultants and lawyers developed in many countries so-called power purchase agreements, also assisted in setup of competitive auctions for solar projects, also supported off-takers, creating in some cases these off-takers. So this is really big additionality of what we've done. Financial additionality was there as well. We found out that even in some advanced countries like Cyprus, it was very difficult to find private banks who would finance such projects. We also found out that this was very dynamic sector, very fast-moving. Prices went down over last 10 years by 85% of solar panels. So dynamics and economics of the sector changed quite substantially. While in some countries, tariffs didn't change at all, as we've seen, as we will highlight later. And also that this is quite a crowded subsector. There is lots of other IFIs who are interested in solar. It seems everybody loves solar. So development agencies, other banks are offering policy advice as well to different governments. So we have to be very careful not to duplicate and to be really additional here. And also, there is, because of this dynamics, there is increased regulatory risk, especially in tariffs setting. It should be flexible. It cannot be really cast in stone. And this leads us to main challenges stemming from this sector. In a few countries, we observed that bigger picture, we of course done successful projects. Projects were implemented. However, we contributed by financing this project to so-called solar bubbles in some countries, especially in Ukraine, to some extent in Egypt and Jordan as well. This was exacerbated by COVID, when the demand for electricity dropped, and the systems of these countries were inflexible. They were not able to decrease production of electricity from other sources, while off-takers had to buy electricity from solar producers. This led to network imbalances and financial distress of off-takers. So a few of off-takers were talked to were in basically bankrupt. So that was not ideal situation. So in the recommendations, which Theo will talk in detail a little bit at the end, we recommend that the bank in the future focuses on integration of solar energy, really, not on the generation. Integration meaning looking at all system, how it works. Can it be more flexible? Funding decommissioning of polluting old plants at the same time as funding generation. Also transmission to other countries so they can sell and transmit this excess electricity. And supporting hybrid auctions together with storage, especially. We haven't seen it in our countries of operation, and we know that it's done in advanced countries in Western Europe, for example, but also in South Africa, for example, Brazil. So it is doable, and despite still technologies being developed, can be done. Also we recommended that in the board documents there are some more rigorous analysis of networking balancing capacities of our clients. It hasn't been done in the past, and that's one reason those bubbles were formed. And also performing tariff level, comparing tariff levels with local energy costs is important to see how more we are adding. Usually these tariffs are well above levelized average cost of energy. And finally, one of our objectives of funding is to bring private banks to financing, and in many sectors we are able to co-finance, syndicate with other banks, with local banks. Here in solar sector, not at all. None of the projects were co-financed with private banks. This is something which needs to be fixed. Requires policy dialogue in the banking sector, which we are pretty good at, so we encourage to look into this. So this is in the nutshell. Now a little bit about the scope. As mentioned, we looked at 10 projects in 6 countries. The reason was because our portfolio is concentrated in 4 countries: Egypt, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Jordan. In other countries, very little. We still picked up Uzbekistan because we started doing projects there. We had one big 100 million loan for a large project in Uzbekistan, plus 3 projects in Cyprus, small projects, and we're closing cooperation in Cyprus, too advanced for us, but we've done some solar projects. We wanted to look at it. Methodology was based on OECD DAC criteria of relevance, looking at relevance, additionality, effectiveness, efficiency of this project, including sustainability, of course, as well. And this encompasses investigation, of course, review of documents and interviews with beneficiaries, consultants, and clients. We went to 4 countries, and we had, because it was just after COVID, we had virtual interviews in Egypt and Kazakhstan, and went to other countries. Just to, I think, no surprises here, context. Solar during that time, which we looked at, 2012, 2020, the capacity, solar capacity in the world increased very rapidly in nearly all countries. At the same time, the levelized cost of energy, when solar energy went down quite substantially. So no surprises here. In 2016, the bank increased twofold, and then been kept increasing funding for solar projects until 2020. And key findings, enabling factors for solar, we're really working with TSOs, with transmission companies, and we've been providing such funding to increase capacity with Ukenergo, for example, in Ukraine, with Kazenergo, with Uzbekenergo. In all these countries, altogether about 2 billion euros in funding for increasing capacity to accommodate renewable energy, solar and wind. Also, capacity building, policy guidance in most countries, it was done, and it was critical for success of these projects. As far as storage, we haven't done much. EBRD just started when we were doing this evaluation, a technical cooperation program focus on storage. And this, of course, going in a good direction, but still nothing to evaluate at the point we are doing it. And as far as cross-border transmission and decommissioning of projects with hydrocarbon generation projects, very little. EBRD has been trying to do it, but these projects with 2 TSOs usually were stuck on procurement, one between Macedonia and Serbia, one between Moldova and Romania. They were not moving at all, so rather poor results there. Another key findings relate to tariffs. This dynamic market, as everybody knows, so tariffs should follow it, and they did in some cases. Most of the countries started with fit-in tariffs, which were set fairly flexibly, that when the cost of panels decreased, these countries were able to decrease fit for the future projects. Of course, no retroactive changes, but for the future solar projects, these tariffs went down, but still the operators were doing about 80% EBITDA, which is excellent. Excellent business, so still very, very attractive. However, in one country, in Ukraine, they haven't been doing this. So this black line shows the tariffs in Ukraine, which were set in stone, were set in primary legislation, very difficult to change. In most other countries, secondary legislation, as it should be done, and easy to change. Here, not. And there was a lot of vested interest, a lot of members of Ukrainian parliament were in fact developers of solar projects, what we found out. So they were interested in keeping them very high, and that's where this bubble, which is shown in the second graph, the gray one, formed. Now we'll pass it to Theo now to present relevance, effectiveness, efficiency.
Cheers. Cheers. Might use these. So are these working? Can you hear me? No? Yes? Potentially? Yeah. I'll try and be quick because I realize we're running low on time and I want to leave a couple of minutes for questions. So we have 3 main criteria which we use to look at our projects. We use relevance, efficiency, and effectiveness. On relevance, we're looking at whether these projects were relevant with our own strategic documents and with the policies of the governments in which we are working. And here we found, sort of perhaps unsurprisingly, that everybody liked solar. Everyone was supportive, the bank was supportive, and so were the governments where we were working. The other key aspect of relevance was additionality, which Tom touched on before. And one, I think, really sort of interesting finding here was the degree of political risk in solar projects. The fact that solar investors were having to make these sign these long-term contracts with government off-takers of energy, such that there was a large degree of political risk, and investing with a multilateral development bank sort of, provided them with perception that we could afford them some kind of political risk carve-out. In reality, that was not always the case. I think, they overemphasized the degree of influence that we had, but that was some sort of, an important attractive point for the partners that we were working with. And finally, as Tom mentioned earlier, we had good financial additionality. So often in many of the countries where we were working, it was very difficult for local banks to offer project financing for solar, either because they didn't have the expertise in terms of sort of how to set up and structure that kind of transaction, or because they didn't have because they faced regulatory barriers, which made that kind of financing prohibitively expensive and not very economically efficient in the slightest. In terms of effectiveness, solar works well, it turns out. So basically, the solar power plants that we supported, nearly all generated electricity in line with expectations. They were constructed on time and under budget as well. I think that's, a key takeaway is that technically these projects were actually relatively straightforward. We could predict with a high degree of certainty how much they would cost, how much energy they would generate, and that's not always the reality when working in some of the contexts where we invest in. We were also interested in employment effects and in local economy effects beyond energy. And here there's a relatively limited picture emerging. There were some temporary construction effects, but the utility scale solar power plants that we visited actually required very little in terms of ongoing employment, small teams of 10 to 15 people. And we also saw relatively limited backwards linkages to local economies with a very high degree of equipment and infrastructure imported in, typically from China, sometimes from other places. So we weren't seeing strong backward linkages in the slightest. And finally, the other key finding for us was one of our objectives as an institution was to try and mobilize and catalyze additional private sector finance into supporting the scale-up of utility-scale solar in these countries. And we broadly didn't hit any of our targets that we'd set there. And that goes back to that point we made earlier, that actually, when we started looking into it in more detail, local banks faced a huge amount of constraints when it came to investing in solar power plants. Whether it be to regulation or capacity, they just weren't in a position to do so. And the investors in these solar power plants, even in countries where you were experiencing rapid growth, such as in Egypt, it was primarily multilateral development banks like ourselves or other impact investors or development finance institutions. Policy dialogue. As Tom mentioned earlier, this is a very fast-changing sector. And so what we found as a result of that we were more effective when we offered ad hoc, responsive advice rather than a large structured program. And Kazakhstan is an interesting example there, where we'd allocated a big budget of 10 million euros for a large policy dialogue program back in 2015. And then when we got down to it, we realized that the World Bank was already doing it, USAID was already doing it, the Kazakhstan government was already doing it, because the situation changed so fast while we were going through our own slow internal bureaucratic approval process. And actually where we were effective was when we were quick and responsive and picking up the phone to people rather than having this large, ambitious agenda at the outset. Second was on low carbon pathways. We worked with the government of Uzbekistan, set up a low carbon pathway. We found that this was a very effective tool in making sure that everybody was on the same page, in having a holistic vision for the sector where solar could grow and energy plants, old inefficient energy plants, would be decommissioned. Bankable PPAs offering long-term stability. That was clearly a critical first step in terms of attracting investors into the sector and offering them the certainty and confidence that this was something worth investing into, which for us was a very challenging part of this whole exercise, given that many of the countries where we work do not have a great climate for attracting external investment. As Tom mentioned earlier with the example in Ukraine, setting feed-in tariffs within primary legislation, that locks them in. That presents big risks when you have a sector which is very dynamic and which is changing a lot, because then it makes it much more difficult to adjust as the technology changes and as the market changes. And then finally, affordability. We saw a big difference in the cost of utility-scale solar in countries where we supported the transition from a feed-in tariff-based system to a competitive auction-based system, where that extra competitiveness acts as a very efficient incentive to get producers to lower prices. Recommendations. I know Tom touched on this briefly earlier, so I won't spend a huge amount of time on this. Integration is clearly incredibly important, both support to grids, also support to storage and support to cross-border connections. Starting to try and get the EBRD to start thinking about supporting hybrid solutions, which also incorporates energy storage. I think the view was that in many of the countries where we're working, we're just sort of branching out into utility scale solar. Well, actually, why can't we sort of be branching out into hybrid storage as well? I think we're at a position where we can start doing that. Network balancing constraints. Tom mentioned this earlier, but again, we've been trying to encourage the EBRD to think in a more holistic fashion and to not think on a sort of project-specific basis, trying thinking about what are the wider systemic effects of setting up these utility-scale solar plants. Does the grid have the balancing capacity to do that? But is this going to lead to some kind of affordability issues if the tariff for solar is set higher than the prevailing cost of energy? And finally, this whole point about trying to scale up private sector finance. It's very clear that if we're going to successfully transition to a carbon zero future, we're going to need private sector financing. And this is one area where we weren't having a lot of success in terms of trying to crowd in private sector financing on the projects that we were supporting. And so, one big push for us is to try and understand why local financial institutions in the countries where we're working are not currently in a position to support solar, and what we can do to help address some of the barriers and constraints that they face. That's us done. Any questions I'd be glad to hear.
Any questions from the audience at all?
Thanks for the very interesting presentation. I will follow up on your last slide and the point of network balancing constraints. So if I understood well, one of your recommendations is also to focus on network infrastructure and storage, which I can understand fully. But do you also consider other flexibility options like energy efficiency and demand response? Is it part of the EBRD portfolio?
It is part of the EBRD portfolio, but one of the things that I think we have found is that we're a large organisation, and the teams which are supporting energy generation are typically not the teams who are supporting energy efficiency, who are typically not the teams who are supporting smart meters in municipalities. And so one sort of other more general recommendation that we're trying to sort of push with the rest of the organisation at the moment is to have a little bit of a more holistic picture, a more joined up approach, so that there's thinking about the demand side, thinking about how to incorporate smart demand technology, as well as energy efficiency, as well as renewable energy, because we are doing all of these things, but it's all sort of a little bit piecemeal and project-led at the moment.
Good morning. Didier Bosbeuf from ADEME. I think your recommendations are really strong and robust. And it's a question maybe to you, but maybe to the audience of evaluator. I think your nature of recommendation are acceptable by a government. And I think generally the conclusion or recommendation I see from evaluator are a little bit far from reality. So my question is more or less, do you consider that the fact that it's a bank which make recommendation has better chance to be accepted, your recommendation by government or taking into account than a recommendation by academics or evaluators?
Well, we've had to work a lot.
If I am a government, I say yes, it's true.
I think a big sort of push in our evaluation department has been working on strengthening our recommendations and trying to get them to a point where they're a bit more feasible. So I'm hoping here that you can see something which is a bit more feasible than maybe something that we produced previously. And as part of that, we now have these technical meetings to discuss recommendations as we're sort of drafting them with our management counterparts to try and sort of get a sense of whether these are feasible, whether there is actually a degree of utility in what we're offering. And we're also trying to sort of make sure that they're concrete actions which can be implemented. They're not sort of pie in the sky.
Yeah, thank you for the question, very important one. And in fact, we have the whole very well-defined process. What happens with our recommendations? There is a follow-up, there is a meeting, as Theo mentioned earlier, to make sure that there is understanding. But the management is able to reject our recommendations, and they do sometimes. In this case, they haven't rejected anything. They can reject, fully accept, or partially accept our recommendations. And then if they reject, of course, they have to justify the rejections. And there is an audit committee of our board which listens to it. It's a big debate, and at the end there is an agreement on which recommendations will be implemented, and they are written into the special system, where then after an action plan is prepared by management, and then they have to really implement them. And we are to verify and report on implementation of each recommendation every 6 months, I think, or we get messages and we get documents or evidence that these recommendations have been implemented. And this is something which was introduced about 3 years ago. It's not, and many banks are moving into this this direction. I guess in case of recommendations prepared by consultants for governments, it's a little bit different, as there is no no system kind of defined and approved. What happens to consultants' reports and their recommendations, and of course depends on the government and their politics.
And actually, the other thing that strikes me is that our recommendations are for management, but our client is the board. And so, you know, sometimes I think as a consultant, I used to be a consultant, sometimes you'd have to shape your recommendations for your client if they were the implementing party. But in this case, our recommendations are not for our client, as it were. And so we can maybe be a little bit more strong at points.
Great. Thank you very much. Jack, just a final quick question.
Hi, it's just a point of clarity, I think. So you probably brushed over it because you're limited in the time that you have available. Just so I'm clear, though, you planned this grid-scale solar project, but didn't really factor in what the capacity constraints were going to be like in the country that you were working in. Is that true to a greater or lesser extent?
I think we were project-led. We're a private sector-focused multilateral development bank, which means that we're demand-led. If we can find opportunities in the market to support projects in the thematic areas where we want to work, then we will. Where we can get caught out is where we'll start supporting projects, and in sectors which are growing incredibly fast, it's difficult to have full awareness of everything else that is going on. And I think that's what you saw in Ukraine slightly, where we were supporting solar, we wanted to support solar, we were caught out a little bit by how fast solar in Ukraine was growing over a very short, 18-month period. As were the Ukrainian government, as was the Ukrainian national grid, as were many other entities. But yeah, I think there's an extent to which I think you can say that we were we were project-led rather than sort of looking from a macro system level.
Yeah, just to add that our bankers have volume targets, and they are driven by selling our services, more or less, selling our credits, not always looking at the bigger picture, of course. And in case of Ukraine, what we came across, for example, were the letters from our management to Ukrainian government at one point saying that your tariffs are unsustainable, that we will not finance any more projects until you fix the tariffs, fix economics. And after this letter, they still finance nearly 100 million in solar projects, adding to this bubble. So this was our main problem. And yeah, our job is to point and highlight these things. So in the future, and the bankers who are chasing the clients and trying to increase the volume of our business are looking at the bigger picture as well. So,
Great. Thanks ever so much, Tom and Theo. And now I'd like to welcome Hubert Dupin from Enedis.
Okay. Hello, everyone.
No, it's that one. It's that one.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Hubert Dupin. I'm head of the flexibility department at Enedis. So my job is quite simple to state, a bit more challenging to do. My job is to make flexibility real for the Enedis users. That is how we can make best use of flexibility to manage and operate our network. And I will focus today on how we can embed flexibility in our system to better connect renewables and to connect them at a cheaper price, at a cheaper cost. So maybe you're not aware, Enedis is actually the main DSO, distribution system operator in France. We operate up to about 20 kilovolts. So we operate 95% of the French territory. So we are kind of out of the picture in Europe. Because most of DSO operate up to high voltage, 100 and so kilovolts. When we think about flexibility at Enedis, we have set them in several use cases. Most of our use cases actually do concern connecting renewables and connecting them at cheaper and faster. So we did some economic assessments of how much flexibility could help connect renewables. I will go over that. When it comes to investment deferral, which I will not show today, but I can answer if you want, we did a study, a thorough study in 2017. It's in French, however. You can have a thesis in English, but it's called Economic Assessment of Smart Grids. And in that study, we did assess how much flexibility would be worth to defer investment to solve demand congestion. And the price is from 0 to about 20 kilo euros per megawatt per year. I believe that value is valid throughout Europe, and to my knowledge, it's a sole assessment that's been made on how much flexibility is worth. From that assessment on, we have changed our process to systematically challenge all our MV reinforcements with a primary substations or feeders, and we are still within that framework of value. So, talking about renewables, first thing that comes to mind is smart connections. I'm sure you've heard of that. So the idea is simple. The reference connection is guaranteeing the producer to be able to inject 100% of capacity the whole time. That's mandatory by law, so that's we offer that. That comes at a price. Now, if we look closer at what kind of reinforcement might be concerned and how much time we would use that reinforcement to evacuate the capacity. In fact, we see that it's very rare that we use that, first of all, the producers at maximum capacity, and it's kind of very rare that that maximum capacity strikes the maximum capacity of the network at that time. So there may be a better solution, which is to connect the producer without reinforcing the network, but in exchange of, from time to time, curtailing that producer. So it comes with a real-time operation. We do forecast of the network, and then we send only the curtailment orders that we need. So in fact, it's been a 7-year story, a 7-year endeavor, collaboration with the Ministry of Ecological Transition, the French regulator, of course, Federation of Producers and Union Française de l'Électricité, which is kind of the French association of electricity stakeholders. So how does it boil down in terms of value? Of course, when you do a reference connection with reinforcement, it comes at the cost of reinforcement, and a network has some losses. It's just the Joule effect. So that does cost some energy, and when you consider over a certain time frame how much energy that would cost, it's kind of significant cost of network. When you do a smart connection, you save costs. Basically, you just, of course, connect the producer to the network, but you do not reinforce the network. So, of course, you save in terms of connection reinforcement costs. You do need to curtail energy. It's kind of a loss for the collectivity because those green electrons are free to produce and they do create value. You must have some extra instrumentation just to command and control those producers. And you have an effect on losses. Actually, it's beneficial to producers to be connected to a network where there are consumers, because in fact, consumers do reduce the flux, consumption reduces the flux of electricity in the network. So overall, the cost assessment, the assessment is to save about 90 kilo euros per megawatt per year for MV producer. Just to say it, the producers that are interested by such an offer are producers that are kind of far away from the primary substations. If they were close to the primary substation, they would just prefer a normal offer without curtailment because the reinforcement will be cheaper. So you need to be kind of far away from the primary substation. And also, you need to be a small enough producer so that there is still room for you to connect to the network and not necessitating reinforcement. So it's kind of an area far away from the primary substation and small enough producers. So overall, it's about 5% of the producers that can benefit from that. It's kind of an amount. In France, that would amount to about 5 million euros per year savings. So it's kind of savings. So since of end of last year, any producer can ask that in an application. We have some thresholds that have been set by the Ministry of Energy. We must guarantee 70% of the capacity to the producer instead of 100% guaranteed capacity in the normal offer. So we cannot curtail them more than 30% in capacity. And the energy that we would curtail should be less than 5% of the total energy that the producer can inject. So nevertheless, it will not so much affect the numbers and the figures that I would show you today. What I would like to focus now is actually unique systems, at least in Europe, to connect renewables to the network. So I talked earlier about the feeder, the MV feeder to the primary substation. Now I'm talking about the primary substation itself and the TSO, the high voltage network. In France, we have some kind of a framework, which is the following. The TSO is first surveying the potential projects, renewable projects in overall France, and they kind of locate them in a 20 by 20 kilometer grid. So it's potential projects. Those people have not applied for connections, but they are kind of thinking it's a project that they have, and we kind of plug into that the policy of how much renewables should be built in a region. That comes with a pool of renewables that we need to connect. With that pool of renewables, we design the optimal network to connect all those renewables. So it's a kind of global optimization. Instead of designing the network at each application, we design the network that is capable to host all those pool of renewables about, say, 10 years in the 10 years from now. So it's already a global saving, and that is kind of unique in Europe. It comes also with another effect. is that instead of billing each customer the price of actual works that are occurred by its specific connection, each renewable producers pays a specific price, a fee that is proportional to the actual capacity that they would connect, but regardless of the actual work that they will require. That unitary proportional share is derived from the regional optimization. So we say to connect about 1 gigawatt of renewables in that region, we would need something like, say, 20 million euros. And we say per megawatt you would connect, you would pay 20 kilo euros. So it does create an even playing field for all renewable producers. It does create some kind of visibility in their business plan. They know in advance how much it would cost. And also it allows us to sign a kind of optimize investments. Now the next step is to insert flexibility in that framework. I show here what was the load curve of a solar panel and a wind farm, and you see that for a solar panel, you do produce at maximum capacity, mathematically 1 hour per year, but in fact, you would produce at 90%, over 90% of the capacity, less than 20 hours a year. So if you were to design the network to host 100% of capacity, in fact, you would use that network 20 hours a year, which is kind of a waste. So if you consider the load curves of all those producers, you combine them with demand, in fact, you can connect more renewables on transformers than you would do with normal offer. I will go a little bit more in detail later on. And the overall effect of that, of France, is to reduce the cost of primary substation by 30%. So it's a significant CapEx cost. Of course, you would need to curtail producers when they would produce rarely at maximum capacity. And that amount is extremely small. It's targeted to be less than 0.8%, 0.06% of the energy. In other words, they would produce 99.94% of the energy, and with that amount of energy, they would save 30% of capex. So it's extremely significant. If we go in detail, how does it work? Without flexibility, of course, when we design the network, there are some capex costs for transformers and network in HV network, and there are losses in transformers. With flexibility, you would connect a bit more producers on the same transformer, so the capex cost per megawatt is less, so you save on capex. Of course, it comes with losses, and it comes with curtailment of energy. You do balance that, and the optimum is when there is lots of solar, you can connect, say, up to 30 or 40 or 50% more solar panel on the transformers that you would do otherwise. And actually, we have started that experiment in real scale in France. So it's inland, it's southwest of France. South, it's north of France. Land is PV area. Some is a wind area. And in fact, all those figures in billion euros and so forth that I showed you boils down on 10 primary substations to be able to host more than 200 megawatts of renewable capacity. I show here the actual investments, the actual reinforcements that would be avoided. So it's kind of significant. We have started that experiment in 2021. That experiment is targeted to last about 4 years. So we have applications of producers, and actually we are now in the process of connecting those producers. Now the main idea is not to curtail producers. It's in fact to let those producers produce, but instead of not being able to evacuate that electricity, is to act on the market and contract some flexibility services with flexibility service provider that would absorb or that would consume electricity at the time who cannot evacuate it through the primary substation. So in fact, everyone is winning. producers are producing, producers are saving cost of capex, and it boils down to consumers being able to get the electricity for free at that time. So actually the price of energy for the consumers is free at the time that we cannot evacuate that energy. So everyone is winning. So we go to the market, that's our A plan, as I would say. B plan is to curtail energy. So we have this flexibility map, which is flexibilityentities.fr, where we publish all of opportunities. And you can see, in fact, the little curtailment that I told you about is what I show here. It's a few megawatts and a few megawatt hour per year that we would need. So to embed flexibilities, well, we start with what has the most value. So, and what's also easier to do. We started with the curtailment for MV producers, smart connection. So it's a business as usual since end of last year. For the regional optimization of connecting renewable, so it's the optimization on a regional scale. We are going live. People that apply just follow regular application. It's not an experiment with a targeted partner. And the target is to save through, for France, overall France, 30% of capex. That is about 300 million euros for our side. We are also starting another use case, which is to connect more PV, more LVPV, low voltage PV, to our network before reinforcements are finished. That means that at some times we need to do some curtailment. So plan A so far, what we can do is only curtail, instead of curtailing the low voltage producers, we will curtail high voltage or medium voltage producers. And the target is to be able to curtail those low voltage producers. And of course, we go to the market. Instead of curtailing producers, we would contract some services. One last thing about flexibility value. In fact, flexibility is a risk transfer. It's a risk transfer from in time and to counterparts. In time, instead of solving the problem by construction, by a reinforcement, you save it later on in time in real-time operation. You say, instead of solving it now, I will solve it in real time by activating flexibility. And instead of solving it with kind of our DSO means, which is reinforcements or tools, we rely on third parties to offer the service that would be needed at that time. So that risk transfer is really the essence of flexibility. If flexibility is not reliable, the whole thing kind of collapses. So flexibility does save a lot of money for inserting renewables. When it comes to, in France, we can also we do scan all our MV reinforcements. Opportunities are more rare there, but it's another story which I can talk later on. If you have some questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thanks very much, Hubert. Any questions from anyone? Sebastian.
Okay, I played the icebreaker. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think that's very interesting for this audience because when we hear about flexibility, usually we think about flexibility on the demand side. And that's quite interesting to see that you are also working on flexibility on the supply side. My question would be, you mentioned this planning framework to anticipate the needs in connections at a regional level. Do you have something similar for what could change due to the increase in solar for on-use or self-consumption? So let's say the scale even smaller?
When it's about self-consumption, if the consumer does not change its consumption behavior, well, the network just sees what's happening. So if the consumer changes nothing, well, he may save money due to tariff changes, but it will absolutely not change anything the network needs. Now, the government indeed has changed its tariff on low voltages for low voltage producers, and that did have an effect. Just to make it simple, when you are considering a high voltage project, being a producer project or a reinforcement project, those projects last, even though they are not the same projects, they last, say, between 5 and 7 years. When you consider medium voltage projects, be they primary substations or feeders or a producer site, those projects last about 2 years, a few semesters. When you think about low voltage projects, sorry, it's a long story, but low voltage project is a matter of months. So when we do our planning, so far we had targets for high voltage projects, medium voltage projects, and low voltage projects. And that's how we designed our regional scales framework. The government has changed the feed-in tariff for low voltage projects, which had a tremendous effect in terms of number of project applications. And all our kind of design has been kind of hit by that thing, is that we have a surge of these low voltage projects with network reinforcements in high voltage and medium voltage that are needed. So in fact, we have those producers that say, okay, in a few months, I want a solar panel on my farm. And we say, in 5 or 7 years, we will be able to connect you. So there is kind of a problem there, because those people need to inject, and reinforcement will come there in a few years. So that's the new use case I told you, is that we would connect those producers as soon as possible. We are not capable yet to curtail them, which would be the normal situation. Instead, we would curtail other producers that are already connected there, be there in high voltage or medium voltage. But the target is to be able to curtail all producers as much as needed. So that does mean that changing the tariff has a huge effect on the renewable applications, which is a good thing. Now the thing is that there is some time frames for assets, be they DSO or TSO or producers, and we have to kind of coordinate all those plannings.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? No? I've just got... Oh. I've just got one very quick question, linked to kind of what Jean-Sebastian was saying about quite a lot of the work that we tend to do is kind of on the demand side, so it's really interesting to see the supply side, and it's definitely something that we're doing more work in. I was just wondering to what extent kind of lessons are being shared around this kind of across Europe and in other countries further abroad.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Actually, involving prosumers, we as a DSO are technologically neutral. When we go for flexibility on the market, we just ask for megawatts as seen from the network. And we go to the market without any discrimination, be it in terms of counterparts or be it in terms of technology. So we say on that network at that time, we need, say, so many megawatts less, or when we want to connect renewables, so many megawatts more in consumption. And then there are some dedicated actors, which are market players, whose job is to recruit all those customers and assemble all the flexibility and provide us a reliable service of so many megawatts. So our job is to analyze the constraints of the network, transform those constraints into flexibility opportunities, do a tender, and then there are some aggregators whose job is to recruit customers and provide us the service. So by law, we cannot address consumers one by one. It's forbidden. And there are some people whose job and skill also is to assemble all the flexibilities into a reliable and economical service. So, of course, we do act on saving electricity. It's our job to do education. It's our job to facilitate life of all those market players. but we cannot go to each customer, send a mailing and say, do you want to be flexible and so forth? Because there are many market players, and we have to also, we cannot discriminate one against the other.
John Sebastian, quick question.
Maybe I will come back to your question because I'm not sure the answer was to your question. The question was, is there a European forum or working group or network, whatever, where you would share with DSO from other countries? Because you mentioned that Enedis was a bit different from the other DSO in size and also in
well, of course,
scope of operation.
Of course, I do exchange with all, I mean, with many DSOs. There are lots of forums and so forth. Actually, there's been a benchmark last year made by Accenture throughout Europe regarding market-based flexibilities. And in effect, we were on the top with British to make use of flexibilities. There are some other countries that make use of flexibilities, but they are more operating on the high voltage, which are Germans and Netherlands and Sweden. And those were targeting actually renewable injection. So to address medium and low voltage flexibilities, actually we do share with our colleagues. I have talks almost every day, and we do benchmarks, and we do some kind of field trips or whatever. I mean, anytime we see each other, we share our progresses.
The very last short question. There are, as part of the trilogues on the revision of the different directives, one part is about the energy efficiency first principle. And in the energy efficiency directive, if the new provision is approved or agreed, the role of TSO and DSO in that would be increased. Is it part of your scope of activities as responsible for flexibility? I see some connections in there.
There are some connections and there are some not connections. When it comes to a permanent change of use of electricity by a customer, it is not flexibility. Of course, they do change their behavior, but it does change the day-to-day load on the network. What I want when I buy flexibility is an additional change. Because basically, when we do settlement, just to make it simple, we see what the customers do at the time of activation, and we compare that with what they would do normally. So if normally, and say if they do some energy savings, if they reinforce the insulation of their house, for example, they would save every day. And I would just compare what they would save every day with just another day. So there wouldn't be any difference. However, what has been seen is that when people engage into energy saving project, one of the side effects is that their premises becomes flexible. To optimize energy, you need to command and control it. And in fact, if you are able to command and control the way you consume energy or the way you produce energy, you become flexible. So a side effect of the energy efficiency is being flexible. And that's why I'm interested in that.
Great. Thank you ever so much, Hubert. And we'll move on to the next presenter. Thank you. So our next presenter is Vasilis from Fraunhofer.
Maybe I'll take the microphone.
Yeah, you can take the microphone.
Yeah. Should be working.
Just letting you know.
I'll be fast. It's that one.
Yeah, that one.
So thank you very much. It's great to be here. After these very practical presentations and insights, I want to take you with me to dig a little bit more into the methodology of evaluating. So a little bit more academic, a little bit more ivory towerish, so to say. My name is Vasilis Anatolitis. I'm from the Fraunhofer Institute for Systems Innovation Research in Karlsruhe, Fraunhofer ISI. And I want to present to you today the regression discontinuity design. Maybe some of you have heard of that. Maybe some of you have already implemented that. So I'm happy to exchange with you on that. So first of all, why are we actually looking into this regression discontinuity design, this RDD? First of all, the European Commission actually requires that all financial support for renewable energies is actually allocated via auctions. So basically, we have renewable energy auctions in place all over Europe. Of course, the support for renewable energies is considered state aid, and that's why the Commission requires that an ex post evaluation is conducted. So to understand this causal impact of the state aid on the recipients. The point is the Commission says, look, we want you to do a counterfactual impact evaluation. Maybe, and such as an idea, use a regression discontinuity design or a difference in difference approach. So the Commission really likes to have this quasi-experimental design approaches. And we've made this experience. We were working with the German Ministry of Economics, the new EEG, and the Commission was quite pushy actually towards these quasi-experimental approaches. So we said, okay, well, let's do this RDD then. The problem is there's actually very few theoretical and empirical literature on that, and there are some sort of guidelines how to do that, but not very specific for our case. So we wondered ourselves, well, does it actually make sense to use the RDD for this impact evaluation? And a little bit more formal, is the RDD a suitable method for evaluating the effect of state aid on renewable energy projects and auction-based support schemes? And by the way, it hasn't been conducted, or we haven't found any examples that it has actually been conducted ever. So before I go deeper into our results and our approach, first of all, what are we talking about? On the one hand, we have renewable energy auctions, just to get everybody on board. Typically, the government sets a certain volume, auctions a certain volume of support or projects to be supported. So for example, we want to support 500 megawatt of solar PV projects, or we want to spend 5 billion euros on supporting onshore wind projects. Then you have several project developers coming forward with their project and stating their required level of support. Usually in euros per megawatt hour, for example, they say, look, that I realize my project here, I need 50 euros per megawatt hour. The other one says 60, the other one only 20. And then the auctioneer starts sorting those projects in ascending order and awarding from the cheapest to the most expensive one until the auction volume is actually reached. What happens then? Of course, the awarded projects get a support approval, and of course, when they're realized, they get the actual support payments, and they have to be realized in a certain period of time. Then coming to a little bit more the funny part of the whole study, the regression discontinuity design. What is it actually? It's a method to analyze a certain effect of a treatment on beneficiary or an outcome. So what do we need for that? So first of all, we have on the x-axis a continuous assignment variable. That's, for example, the grades in school to get a scholarship, or for example, how much energy you're consuming, or even it can be even a certain area where you're living in. So it just needs to be continuous. Then this continuous variable has a certain cutoff, a threshold to assign a certain treatment. For example, all the projects on the left of this cutoff line, the cutoff value, get the treatment, and the others not. For example, the same if you get if you look at grades at high school, if you're above a certain grade, you get a scholarship. The others below that grade don't get it. That's basically the requirements. And what kind of assumptions do we have? There is a discontinuity between these two groups. And if we look very, very closely to this threshold value, we can see that, okay, they're actually, if you're very close to that, and the people or project developers cannot decide if they get the treatment or not, it's basically a random allocation. So we have basically a random allocation, a quasi-experimental setting. which means they're actually not that different. They're actually the same. They cannot decide, do I get the treatment or not? But it has to be very close to this threshold. And then, of course, the only difference is that the ones get the treatment and the others not. And that's the question to it. So basically, the treatment we can control, we can get the effect of the treatment just by looking at the projects or actors close to this threshold. Getting to our research question, how do we answer it actually? So on the one hand, we conduct experiments with randomized data. So we actually created our own data just to understand how does this RDD actually work. And on the other hand, we conducted 2 case studies with real auction data, real auction outcomes for Greece and Italy. So you heard about this theoretical concept, how we could actually conduct this RDD. Now we need to apply it actually for our renewable energy auctions. And as I said, there are actually no examples or real in-depth guidelines for that. So we started thinking about, okay, what is actually the dependent variable, the outcome variable that we want to analyze, to look at? And in our case, it was the project's realization. Was the project actually built or not? So a 0, 1 variable. Then what is the actual treatment that we want to analyze? Of course, that was quite easy. It was the support, or rather the support approval. Then the assignment variable, we thought about it quite a lot, but in the end, it made sense to use the submitted bid prices. Because again, we have the submitted bid prices, and if you are below a certain threshold, you get the support. If you're above it, you don't get the support. And of course, then the question is, what is the threshold, the cutoff value? It's the highest awarded bid price, no surprise. So. And last but not least, you need to choose a model, a regression model, which made it even worse for us because our outcome variable was 0, 1, so a binary one. And as all of you who have heard a little bit about statistics know, you cannot use this normal regression analysis or the OLS regression. So you would rather opt for a logistic regression. And I can promise you, I think there is only one paper dealing with RDD with a logistic regression. So it was very, very difficult to get any experience on that. So we use this logistic regression to estimate this average treatment effect, so the actual causal impact of the support approval on the realization of projects. Jumping to our results. So we wanted to see what's happening. We used our randomized data and looked at a bandwidth of 0.4 cent per kilowatt hour, and we used different realization probabilities for the awarded group, so our treatment group, and the non-awarded group, the control group. Looking at for different sample sizes, we looked, okay, do we get significant results or not? Because if you just from your gut feeling, the awarded ones were should be realized. 80% of all the awarded projects should be realized, and only 0.5% of the non-awarded ones. So just from the gut feeling, yeah, you would say, okay, there is some impact, some significance of the effect. But looking, we had quite a lot of different sample sizes. So from 10, 100 until 1,000 data points observations, we found significant and insignificant effects. So if it's here 1, it's usually insignificant, and 0 here is significant. So okay, we thought, okay, let's play a little bit more around with the different realization probabilities. Here again, the difference is becoming a little bit lower. So okay, so actually it should be less significant. That was our first idea. In the end, we had only significant effects. We were quite surprised about that. And last but not least, we thought, okay, let's go. All the awarded projects are built, and all the non-awarded ones should still be with a 40% probability be realized. And there we had only insignificant effects. And we were wondering, okay, what is happening here? Does it have to do maybe with the sample size? We reduced the sample size quite a lot, and still we had a mixture of significant and insignificant effects. So we thought, okay, let's check, let's keep it like that. Maybe it has to do with the with these outliers, the special projects. But let's look at our case studies and try to replicate it and understand it better. So we used data from Italy and Greece because there were a lot of the other presenters mentioned the data availability and how important it is for the evaluation. And actually only Greece and Italy have publicly available auction data, renewable energy auction data, which includes the awarded and the submitted bids, the non-awarded ones. In Greece, we looked at the 4 solar PV auctions and 2 onshore wind auctions, and in Italy, 3 onshore wind auctions. And the first thing you might realize is what I mentioned with the gut feeling. We had a lot of discussions internally as well. Why do we need to do this regression discontinuity design? You can clearly see, of the non-awarded projects, nothing was realized. From the other ones, quite a lot. In any case, it makes still sense since these values can shift, and to really understand what was the effect, you need to conduct it. Then we looked at the special cases, so to say. This means the awarded projects that were not realized, which is weird or against the idea, and the non-awarded ones that were actually realized. So, and we saw, okay, for Greece, we have actually no projects that were not awarded and realized, and in Italy it was only 1. So looking at the results for Greece, again here, this is the bid price, the submitted bid price. This is the threshold, the highest awarded bid. So all of these projects here were awarded support, that's why they are blue. And all these ones here in black, they were not awarded the support. And here again, the realization, if the projects were built or not. In the end of the day in Greece, there were no outliers, as we have already indicated. And as you can see here, maybe you can't really read that, but we have values of 0.9 for the significance levels, so completely insignificant effect. So to speak, the support for renewable energies in Greece didn't have any impact on the realization of projects. We'll get to that later on. In Italy, we played around with this bandwidth. And the red line indicates around the threshold. The red line is the bandwidth where we said, okay, this is close to the threshold. These projects are the same. There is again no outlier. And if you look actually at the significance level, it's not significant. As soon as we broaden this bandwidth, we have 1 small outlier here. And if that outlier is included, we see it jumps and becomes quite significant. So in a nutshell, what does it mean for us? We get significant results only if we have these two outliers. And even with only 18 observations, it's possible to get a significant result, a significant effect. Coming to the conclusions and discussion. So what did we learn from the case studies, or what did we see? Of course, they were part of our research question, but we can derive some information out of them. So basically in Italy, we can show that the treatment effect was significant and more than 70 percentage points. What does it mean? There is a causal impact of the state aid, of the aid to renewable energy projects. In other words, they actually need the financial support or the support approvals to be built. That's what we showed with our analysis here. In Greece, on the other hand, the treatment effect was insignificant because there were no outliers. So the question is, so if we just follow and trust our analysis, there was no impact of the support on the realization of the projects. So the projects actually didn't need the support, but that's not correct. So that's one of the results of our analysis. Don't trust the RDD blindly. So to derive a little bit more general recommendations or insights, so if you want to be very positive, in principle, the RDD can be an adequate method to evaluate the impact of state aid. So it can work, but several requirements need to be met. So first of all, the basic one is that the auction round needs to be oversubscribed, which means that it shouldn't be the case that all the projects that participated were awarded. That's quite bad from an auction perspective anyway, but for the RDD, it's catastrophic because we don't have any, treatment group is there, we don't have any control group. So it doesn't work per se. Then the next important requirement we have to face is that the award must be based on the price only, and always in ascending order. So it shouldn't be any, in some Greek auctions, it was the case that very expensive projects were awarded before the less expensive ones. And then the RED cannot be applied either. Last but not least, as I mentioned, for our approach here with the logistic regression, the treatment and the control group both need at least to have one realized and non-realized project close to the threshold, which is quite a hard requirement, I have to admit. Otherwise, you get insignificant results because of this perfect fit of the logistic regression. So as you can see, quite a lot of requirements. Just to think out of the box, okay, it somehow works, but not really. What alternatives do we have to do this evaluation? So from the methodological perspective, one idea would be to aggregate the data. We did this in our analysis, actually. So to take a lot of auction rounds together, centered bid, and methodologically, it worked. But the question is, did we break a lot of assumptions? And that's one of my fears here, because can you really compare projects around a threshold over several rounds? Because the threshold moves from each round, so it might be a little bit difficult. Then, of course, difference in difference approach or the instrumental variable could be another approach, and is actually suggested by the European Commission as well. The problem is we have stronger assumptions there, and it's a little bit more complex, I would say, compared to the RDD. And of course, the other approach would be to say, leave me alone with all these quasi-experimental approaches. Let's conduct a more theory-based qualitative evaluation. From my point of view as an economist, it's a little bit less robust, and the quantitative insights are missing. And it's a little bit, it takes more time and effort to conduct all these surveys and interviews and so on and so forth. And then you might wonder, okay, let's use some other variables. Why do you need to stick to your weird 0, 1 and everything? Okay, the other dependent variable that we could think of in our case is the WACC. The problem is, as you all know, we need project level WACC data. We don't have that. And another idea would be like, okay, maybe check the project size. Does it have any effect of that? There's not really a control group there. Maybe for energy efficiency might be a little bit easier to look at the emission savings or energy savings, but I'm happy to discuss with you that later. And looking at another assignment variable, for example, the project size doesn't make sense because they can actually decide, am I below or above the threshold? And that was actually an idea, a proposition from the Commission, which I was a little bit worried about. And it doesn't make sense to look at anything else because the awarded bid prices, the awards are based on the bid prices in most cases. So we don't have many alternatives on that. So in a nutshell, again, I'm a very optimistic guy. The RDD can actually be an adequate method to evaluate the effect of renewable energy support allocated via auctions. But many requirements need actually to be met to be able to conduct that. Thank you very much, and I'm happy and open for questions.
Thanks very much, Vasily. Any questions?
Hi, thanks. Really interesting presentation and study. I'm Joel Franklin, Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. I've just got kind of obscure questions about if you go back to your conclusion slide. two maybe obscure questions. One of them is, could you just replace the price with a different continuous variable instead, say effectiveness per price or cost, and would that work just as well if you didn't want to use price? Cost. And then secondly, even more obscure, I guess you have bandwidths. Does that mean you use some kind of a square weighting function, or could you use a kernel function in order to weight data points that are further along, so you don't have so much of a threshold effect outside the band and within the band?
Thank you very much. Quite good questions. I think in general, the RDD, there can be another continuous variable. In our auction case, it's a little bit difficult because the assignment variable should have an impact or should determine if you get the treatment or not. And in some other support schemes, it's, for example, the project size, or even in auctions. For example, in Germany, you cannot participate with a project larger than 10 megawatt. The problem is, if you take the project size, as a project developer, you can decide if your project is below 10 megawatt or above 10 megawatt. So it's not really a proper assignment variable. And we thought about others, but we didn't really find any good approach, especially in this auction context. Some other studies have done it, for example, to look at borders. So, for example, you could take some projects in Germany, from Germany, that get an award or get a support payment, and some others in France, close to the border, who don't get anything, and just compare whether realized or not. But it's not feasible in the auction context. So I would rather say no, there is no other, no. We can think about it later on if maybe you have some other good ideas what to use. And to the other question, yes, indeed, there are some approaches to using kernel function. We focused here really very plainly just to get a feeling, a grasp of that, to really just cut it off and say, look, no, we just want to have a look at the very thin bandwidth, which is more typical is more in line with the actual idea behind the RDD, to say, look, if you're close to it, you should be very similar.
Bear with me.
Yes, thank you, Guido from Aripo. I was wondering, like, from looking at your RDD plot, why you didn't use a fuzzy regression discontinuity design, because the assignment was not really deterministic, right? But there's like, it was not, and you mentioned some of the cases, so kind of the question why you didn't use fuzzy RDD. And then regarding the decision to use logistic regression, I think in particular like among economists, I'm a political scientist, but they love to use logistic regression, but economists love to use simple OLS because it requires less assumptions. So I'm wondering whether you made comparisons and found differences there. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I might start with the second question, and of course then to forget the first one. No, but of course the second question. Of course, the first thing we did was run an OLS regression on that. Of course, that's like as an economist. But basically, no, we compared it. First of all, the problem, we used the logistic regression because we tried to fit this binary variable, the outcome. So in the end, was it realized? Yes, 1, or no, 0. So it made proper sense. Of course, when we saw the results were a little bit tricky, let's say, or difficult to interpret, we ran the OLS regression, and basically we came to similar, or no, the other way around. So basically all of our results were significant. The effect, this average treatment effect, was in a similar range actually. So that was a good point, but everything was significant. And then we started thinking about, okay, why shouldn't we? Why wasn't it significant with the logistic regression? And that's actually a good point. That's why I don't like the RED in the context of renewable energy auctions because of that. We don't have any other outcome variable, and I think the RDD can be used very nicely if you have a OLS regression with an outcome that is continuous. For example, revenues of a company, energy savings, whatsoever. So yeah, that's one point. And the other thing is, yeah, the fuzzy, that's actually a good point. We wanted to keep it simple at the beginning. And so we said, okay, let's just go for the sharp one and see. And it basically makes sense to use the sharp one here as well, because we identified, I have to say, we got some data from the German government as well to check it out. And then we identified some issues or even some problems in the data quality there, because usually if you are below the threshold, below the highest awarded bid price, you should get the support, and otherwise not. And everything else doesn't make sense, where the fuzzy would make sense to use. But in the near future, we might use it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's time for one very quick question.
I was just going to make a question or kind of comment. One of your alternative approaches was to do just qualitative, and I was thinking that this your paper shows the strength of using both quantitative and qualitative. Do you kind of get the both? You get the rigor and the robustness, but then you get to kind of look behind the data and see some interesting. So it just to me showed the power when the budget can manage it to do both quantitative and qualitative. So very interesting results. Thanks.
Oh yeah, thanks for the comment, and I totally agree with you. I think it's, I think that the bigger picture is important, and that's why it's important for governments or other bodies who want to have evaluated something evaluated, to have enough budget and to provide enough budget and time to do like a rigorous and good evaluation using both qualitative and quantitative insights. I think then you get a much clearer and better picture than just focusing on one or the other. And thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much to all four speakers for today's session. Thanks for all the questions. Lunch is now served.